My name is Madison Cole, and I was 22 years old when my dad leaned in at my graduation, smiled for the cameras, and whispered in my ear, "You don't deserve that degree." Everyone around us laughed. They thought he was joking, being playful, doing that proud father thing where you tease your kid on their big day. I just smiled back. I smiled so wide my cheeks hurt, so convincingly that nobody suspected the truth. But that moment burned into me like a brand. Like someone had pressed hot iron directly against my chest and held it there until my skin bubbled and charred. That's what his words did. They seared themselves into my bones, into my blood, into every breath I took for the next 5 years. If you've ever been underestimated by someone you love, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You know that specific kind of pain that comes when the person who's supposed to champion you becomes the one tearing you down. Tell me where you're watching from, because this one's personal. This one cost me everything before it gave me anything back. Growing up under Richard Carter meant living in a world where love was measured in results. My report cards weren't celebrated. They were trophies for him to display. My achievements weren't mine. They were extensions of his legacy, proof of his superior parenting, evidence that the Carter bloodline produced excellence. There were no bedtime stories in my childhood. No soft moments. No gentle corrections or patient explanations. There was only the constant, suffocating pressure to perform, to excel, to be perfect. And when I wasn't perfect, which was often because I was a child, there was his disappointment. Cold and heavy as stone. My brother died when I was 14. Asthma attack. He was 12. And at the funeral, after everyone had left and the house was silent except for my mother's muffled crying upstairs, my father looked at me across the dining room table and said 7 words I'll never forget. "It should have been you instead of him." He said it quietly, calmly, like he was commenting on the weather, like he was stating an obvious fact that everyone already knew but was too polite to mention. I didn't cry. I couldn't. Something inside me shut down that day. Some essential part of being human just stopped working. And maybe that's what he wanted. Maybe he needed me to become the son he lost, hard and unbreakable and incapable of weakness. Or maybe he just hated me. I still don't know which would hurt less. The pattern continued for years. Public praise, private humiliation. In front of colleagues and family friends, I was his brilliant daughter, the pride of his life, destined for greatness. But behind closed doors, nothing I did mattered. When I proposed a new inventory system for his manufacturing plant at 16, spent 3 months teaching myself database management just to impress him, he glanced at it for maybe 30 seconds before sliding it back across his desk. "Cute," he said, "but stick to school. Leave business to people who understand it." When I got accepted to Stanford with a full scholarship, he told the whole country club. Posted it on every social media platform. Gave a toast at dinner with his business partners. Then, driving home that night, just the 2 of us in his Mercedes, he said, "Don't get too comfortable. Smart girls are a dime a dozen out there. You'll be lucky to finish in the top half of your class." I finished 3rd in my class. 3rd out of 372 engineering students. And you know what he said? Well, 3rd isn't first. That was it. That was the sum total of his response to 4 years of sleepless nights, of panic attacks before exams, of sacrificing every social opportunity and romantic possibility and normal college experience just to prove myself to him. So that night after graduation, after the ceremony where he smiled for the cameras and destroyed me with a whisper, I went back to my apartment and I packed a single suitcase. Not because I had so few possessions, I had plenty, but because I wanted to leave everything behind. Everything that connected me to him, to that house, to that version of myself who still believed his approval was achievable. I packed only what I needed to survive, and I left. No goodbye. No closure. No dramatic confrontation where I told him how much he'd hurt me, because I knew it wouldn't matter. Narcissists don't feel remorse. They don't suddenly see the light and apologize. They just find new ways to twist the knife. I took that degree he said I didn't deserve, and I made myself a promise. One day, he would remember my name for all the right reasons. One day, I would become so successful, so undeniable, so impossibly beyond his reach that he would choke on his own regret. Have you ever walked away from someone just to prove they'd regret losing you? If not, you need to understand something. Sometimes walking away is the loudest revenge. Sometimes silence screams louder than any argument ever could. I moved to Austin, Texas. Started over completely. Took a job at a tiny startup that paid barely enough to cover rent and ramen noodles. Worked 16-hour days. Taught myself everything I could about clean technology, automation systems, industrial efficiency. I was hungry in a way that went beyond ambition. I was possessed. Every rejection fueled me. Every setback made me more determined. And slowly, painfully, I built something. 5 years after I walked out of his life, I was 29 years old and co-founder of Epsilon Dynamics, a clean tech firm designing automation systems that cut industrial costs by 30%. We had 12 employees, a patent portfolio worth millions, and investors who actually believed in us. My partner, Melissa Nguyen, was a genius with business strategy, the kind of sharp, fearless woman who made things happen through sheer force of will. We complemented each other perfectly. I was the technical brain. She was the strategic heart. When we closed our Series B funding round, $28 million, Melissa raised her glass of cheap champagne in our cramped office and grinned at me. "You ready to make some enemies?" she asked. I laughed, genuinely laughed for maybe the first time in years. "One in particular," I said. Because here's what I hadn't told her yet. Our investors had suggested we consider acquiring a struggling manufacturing firm. Vertical integration, they called it. Buy up a company that could use our automation systems, prove the concept works at scale, increase our valuation before the next funding round. They'd compiled a list of potential targets, mid-size manufacturers with outdated systems and mounting debt. Companies vulnerable enough to be affordable, but stable enough to be salvageable. The company at the top of that list was Carter and Wesson Manufacturing. My father's company. Would you have done it? Would you buy your parents' failing company just to watch them fall, or to prove you've risen? Would you take that chance to finally, definitively show them exactly how wrong they were about you? I didn't hesitate. Not for a second. Carter and Wesson was hemorrhaging money. Their systems were outdated by at least a decade, still using manual processes that competitors had automated years ago. Their contracts were shrinking. Their workforce was demoralized. And my father, stubborn as always, refused to modernize because he couldn't admit the world had changed without asking his permission first. He was drowning, and he was too proud to grab the life preserver. So I became the life preserver, except it was wrapped in razor wire. The acquisition took 4 months. 4 months of lawyers and accountants and due diligence and board negotiations. 4 months where he had no idea who was circling his company like a shark. We operated through shell corporations and intermediaries. Our offer was generous, too generous, really. We were paying more than the company was worth because I needed this. I needed him to take the deal. I needed him trapped before he realized who had set the trap. By the time Carter and Wesson's board realized who their mysterious new buyer was, it was too late. The contracts were signed. The money had changed hands. The deal was done. August 12th, 2021. That's the date everything changed. That's the date I walked into the Carter and Wesson boardroom for the first official meeting as the new majority owner. The board members were all there, looking nervous and curious. And my father was there too, sitting at the head of the table like he still owned the place. Like his name was still on the building. Like his word was still law. He looked older. His hair had gone completely gray, slicked back the way he'd always worn it. But his face looked harder somehow, more carved, like bitterness had chiseled away everything soft. His hands gripped the edge of the table, veins visible, knuckles white. I set my briefcase down, pulled out a chair, sat across from him, and I watched his face cycle through confusion, recognition, disbelief, and finally rage. Pure, impotent rage. "This is some kind of joke," he said. His voice was shaking. Not with sadness or regret, with fury. With the indignation of a king who's just been informed that peasants are real and they're voting him out. I slid the contract across the table. No, Dad, I said, keeping my voice perfectly calm, perfectly professional. This is graduation, part 2. The silence in that room was beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. The board members looked at each other, unsure whether to speak. My father's jaw worked like he was chewing glass. His hands trembled against the mahogany. Then one of the board members, Patricia Chun, who'd been with the company for 20 years, cleared her throat. Mr. Carter, the vote has already been finalized. Ms. Cole and Epsilon Dynamics now hold controlling interest. The board has reviewed the restructuring plan, and we believe it's in the company's best interest to proceed. He looked at her like she'd stabbed him. You can't be serious. She's my daughter. She doesn't know anything about manufacturing. I know enough to save your company, I interrupted. My voice came out harder than I intended. All that anger I'd been swallowing for years was suddenly there, right at the surface, demanding to be heard. I know enough to modernize your systems, retain your workforce, and make this company profitable again. Which is more than you've managed in the last 5 years. His face went red, then purple. I thought he might actually have a stroke right there. But the vote was already done. The board had already chosen survival over loyalty. They'd already chosen me. I won. Except, and here's where everything gets complicated, victory doesn't feel the way you think it will. I thought winning would feel triumphant, powerful, like justice finally being served. Instead, it felt hollow, empty, like I'd climbed to the top of a mountain only to realize the view was just more mountains, stretching endlessly in every direction. And then, 2 months later, everything got worse. I got an email, 3 a.m. on a Tuesday. No subject line, no message text, just an attachment, epsilon_internal_audit_2016, PDF. My hands were shaking when I opened it, because I knew, immediately, instinctively, that this was bad. You don't get anonymous emails with audit files at 3 in the morning unless someone's trying to destroy you. The file contained proof that my early code, the foundational algorithms that Epsilon Dynamics was built on, came from restricted Stanford research. Research I'd had access to during my graduate work. Research that was technically university property, covered under intellectual property agreements I'd signed as a student. If this leaked, I'd lose everything. The company would collapse. Investors would sue. Partners would bail. My reputation, everything I'd spent 5 years building, would be annihilated. And at the bottom of the file, barely visible in the scan, was a signature. Richard Carter. He'd known. Somehow, he'd known about the code origins the whole time. He'd been sitting on this information, waiting for the perfect moment to use it. Waiting until I'd climbed high enough that the fall would really hurt. Would you call that justice or evil? Because I've been asking myself that question for 3 years and I still don't have an answer. That's when I realized the takeover wasn't the end of the story. It was barely the middle. He wasn't done fighting. And neither was I. I spent the next 6 weeks barely sleeping. Melissa and I went through every line of code, every algorithm, every function. We brought in intellectual property lawyers. We analyzed the research agreements. And we found something my father hadn't counted on. The code had evolved. Significantly. The original Stanford research was just the seed, a starting framework. But over 5 years of development, Melissa and I had rewritten, expanded, and fundamentally transformed it into something entirely new. Something that no longer resembled the original research in any meaningful way. We had documentation proving the evolution. GitHub commits with timestamps. Design documents. Everything we needed to show that whatever we'd started with, we'd created something completely original. His weapon was useless. But I didn't tell him that immediately. I let him think he'd won. Let him believe he still had power over me. Because I wanted him to feel what I'd felt for 29 years. Helpless. The confrontation happened on a Thursday night. Late October, rain hammering against the windows of Carter and Wesson's Dallas headquarters, which was technically my headquarters now. I was working late, reviewing restructuring plans, when my assistant called my office line. Ms. Cole, there's someone here to see you. He doesn't have an appointment, but he says it's urgent. I knew who it was before she even said his name. Send him in. He walked into my office, his old office, the one that used to have his nameplate on the door, like a ghost haunting his former throne. He'd aged even more in those 2 months. His suit hung looser. His eyes were shadowed. You think you won, Madison? He didn't sit. Just stood there, silhouetted against the rain-streaked windows. You think buying my company makes you victorious? You built everything on my foundation. You used my connections, my reputation, my... Your what? I interrupted. Your abuse? Your cruelty? Yes, Dad, you're absolutely right. I built my entire empire on the foundation of your neglect. Every time you told me I wasn't good enough, you laid another brick. Every time you dismissed my ideas, you poured another beam. You constructed this, piece by piece. With every moment you made me feel worthless. So thank you. Thank you for making me so desperate to escape you that I had no choice but to become extraordinary. He slammed the audit file onto my desk. Step down or I bury you. That code is stolen. Everyone will know you're a fraud. Everything you've built will collapse. I looked at the file, then at him, and I smiled. Actually smiled. Because for the first time in my entire life, I had something he wanted and couldn't take. Control. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a flash drive. Slid it across the desk to him. That audit file you're threatening me with? It's based on old data. Melissa and I rewrote everything. Completely. Every algorithm, every function, every line of code has been documented, time-stamped, and verified by intellectual property lawyers. The research you're talking about was just a framework, a starting point. What we built is entirely original. Your weapon doesn't exist. It never did. I watched the color drain from his face. Watched realization settle over him like a shroud. He'd played his final card, and it was worthless. You destroyed me, he whispered. No, Dad. I leaned back in my chair, let the satisfaction wash over me. You taught me how. He left without another word, walked out of that office, out of the building, out of my life. And I let him go. Because revenge, I'd learned, isn't about destroying someone. It's about proving they no longer have power over you. It's about standing in the space they used to occupy and realizing you're not afraid anymore. 3 weeks later, his mansion burned down. Electrical fire, they said. Faulty wiring. He wasn't home when it happened. He'd been staying at a hotel downtown, too broke to maintain the house properly after losing the company. Most of the structure was destroyed. Investigators ruled it an accident. But they found something in the wreckage. Something that survived the flames somehow, protected in a metal desk drawer that didn't fully burn through. It was a photograph. My graduation photo, the one they'd taken right after he whispered those poisonous words. The frame was warped and blackened, but the photo itself was intact. And on the back, written in his handwriting, were 5 words. You always did deserve it. I don't know when he wrote them. Maybe that night, after the board meeting. Maybe years ago, in some rare moment of clarity. Maybe right before the fire, as some kind of final confession. I'll never know. And here's the thing. Here's what nobody tells you about revenge. It doesn't fix anything. It doesn't heal the wounds. It doesn't erase the years of pain. Destroying him didn't make me whole again. Proving him wrong didn't give me back my childhood or my brother or the relationship we could have had if he'd just been capable of love. But it did give me something, proof that I survived. Proof that his cruelty didn't break me. It refined me, turned me into something harder, sharper, more resilient than he ever was. Revenge gave me power. But you know what gave me peace? Forgiveness. Not the kind where you pretend the hurt never happened. Not the kind where you excuse the abuse or welcome the abuser back into your life. But the kind where you acknowledge that hurt people, where you recognize that his cruelty came from his own damage, his own father's failures, his own inability to process grief and loss and fear. That doesn't make what he did okay. It doesn't absolve him, but it lets me put down the weight of hating him. It lets me stop carrying his poison in my veins. I still run Epsilon Dynamics. We've expanded into 6 countries. Our automation systems are industry standard now. Forbes called me a disruptor to watch. My face was on magazine covers. I did everything I promised myself I would do. But the victory I'm most proud of isn't the company or the money or the recognition. It's the fact that I can look at that burned photograph, at those 5 words he finally admitted, and feel sadness instead of rage. Feel grief instead of satisfaction. Because rage is easy. Rage is simple. Rage keeps you moving when everything else would make you stop. But rage also consumes you from the inside out. It turns you into the thing you're fighting against. Forgiveness is harder. Forgiveness requires you to be stronger than your pain. And that's the real victory. Would you forgive, or would you let them burn? Would you choose peace, or would you choose power? Because sometimes you can't have both. Sometimes the price of revenge is the part of yourself that could have healed. I think about him sometimes. Wonder if he's still alive, still struggling, still carrying all that bitterness and pride. Wonder if those 5 words were real, or just guilt, or just one last manipulation. I'll never know for sure. But I do know this. Pain can build empires. Trauma can become fuel. The worst moments of your life can become the foundation for your greatest achievements, if you let them. If you refuse to let them destroy you. If you take all that poison and alchemize it into something powerful. My name is Madison Cole. I was 22 when my father told me I didn't deserve my degree. I'm 32 now. And I've built a life he could never have imagined, not because he believed in me, but because he didn't. Sometimes the greatest gift cruel people give us is the motivation to prove them catastrophically wrong. That's my story. That's my revenge. That's my redemption. And if you're carrying someone else's poison right now, if someone told you you'd never make it, you'd never be enough, you'd never deserve good things, I need you to hear this. They were wrong. Build your empire anyway. Prove them wrong. And then, when you're standing on top of everything you created from the ashes of their cruelty, choose forgiveness. Not for them. For you. Because that's the final victory. That's the moment when you finally, truly win.